So my first question for you, Brandon, in your opinion, what makes a good story?
Ooh, what makes a good story? That is a very big question. And it's one that I think about a lot. And I'm not sure if there's one single answer to what makes a good story, because there's so many people out there. What makes a good story is really individualized. But I would say it's a confluence of a group of things. It is character, setting, and plot glued together with conflict. So really it's the conflict that makes a story. There's an old, adage or an old saying in creative writing fields that the queen died isn't a story. The queen died and the king died of grief is a story, because that grief is the emotion. It is the conflict. There's actually conflict in there. So yeah, conflict gluing together all those ideas.
That's awesome. Okay, how does Utah or any Utah-influenced elements make it into your books? One example that I thought of from the top of my head was Elantris, obviously. I'm going to butcher the character's name. Rowden.
Yeah. How do you pronounce?
I say Rowden.
Rowden. Yeah.
I know you talk about in your author's notes that one of the characters is inspired by your time on your mission.
Yes.
So I'm curious, how does Utah show up in the world of Brandon Sanderson's books?
So Utah shows up all over the place in Brandon Sanderson's books, but the one that I point to is not one that people immediately jump to. The one I point to is the Stormlight Archive, because the Stormlight Archive began in part because I was in college with a photography major. His name's Micah. He took my early photographs. He ended up in the books, Captain DeMoe. Captain DeMoe is Micah, my college roommate, and I was his lovely assistant. Meaning he made me carry photography equipment all around the state. It was good for me to get out of the house. I would sit in my basement and I would type on stories, and Mike is like, nope, we're going on a photography trip, Brandon. And he took me to the gorgeous vistas in southern Utah, and I fell in love with the slot canyons. And I remember one time being at a slot canyon, he's like, we have to hurry because there's going to be some rain. And I'm like, oh, like really bad rain? It's like, no, just a shower. But in a slot canyon, a little shower can turn deadly because all the water flows in the canyon and it turns into a giant rush. And that hit me. And if you've read the Stormlight Archive, you can see how the chasms and how the vistas of the Shattered Plains were born out of my travels to places like Little Wild Horse or even Zion and things like this. So the slot canyons of Utah, the topography of Utah, directly influenced the Stormlight Archive. You mentioned Elantris. And I would say that there is a Utah connection, but it's more a religious connection, right? I served a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and on that mission I was like, ooh, what if someone were an evil missionary? That's a cool idea. And so I developed one of the plot lines in Elantris about a character named Brathan, who is an evil missionary. He's a missionary for a religion kind of, my pitch is if the Vikings had founded a Catholicism-like really hierarchical church. And he's been told, look, go and convert these people. If you don't, we're going to come in and conquer them. It's time. And so he's got this deadline of convert them for their own good, and he's there for all the wrong reasons. And that was really fun for me to write.
That's awesome. And I know in your newest book, and it's right behind us, Songs of the Dead, you dedicated it to a Utah radio station.
Okay. I didn't.
The
other author did.
Okay.
So,
okay, good to know.
Yeah. So
well, do you know what the background behind that was?
I don't.
Okay.
He just did. So Songs of the Dead, this may or may not. So that's really a hymn project off of an outline I gave him about 8 years ago.
Oh, cool.
So it's more of a Peter O'Reilly thing than a Brandon Sanderson thing.
Are there any other Utah instances that you can think of in your books?
Other Utah instances, there's an Idaho instance. So my family lives in Idaho Falls, and I live in Utah. And I was driving up to see them early in my writing career, and I passed through a fog bank at 70 miles an hour, and the sight of that fog curling, it was right past Tremonton. So right after you leave Utah, right around the Malad area, and I hit this, and that visual was so interesting to me that I was like, wow, I got to do something with this. And that turned into the Mists from Mistborn. That's the first idea I can point to with me thinking of the idea for Mistborn. So right outside Utah, right on that border, that one. But, stories come from everywhere. And my everyday life definitely influences. And I bet we could take every book that I've written, and if I thought about it long enough, I could point to some little Utah connection.
Well, that is actually a good segue into my next question, which I feel like you kind of answered, which is, does life in Utah show up in your books? I'm thinking of a particular moment from Fan X when I saw you speak, and a fan asked you a question about how you write about mental health representation in your books. And you spoke a little bit about your son and his struggles and how it was really important for you to have that written in your books. So I guess maybe the question there is, are there other parts of your life that show up in these books that maybe Utahns might resonate with?
Yeah. So it's interesting how ideas come to authors, right? And everything in our lives ends up somehow ending up in a book. All the people we know, all of the things we experience. I have a book coming out in December, and it's called The Fires of December. And I don't know if you've ever done this, but I sometimes think, man, what would it be like if I could travel back into my teenage self's body with my current understanding? How weird would that be? And I took that idea and I ran with it, and that became a story, right? In the Stormlight Archive, when I was sitting down to write, I don't know if you know the story of the Stormlight Archive, but I wrote it poorly once and threw it away. In 2002, I had a draft of this book and it just didn't work. Something about it wasn't working. And so I took another 6-7 years working on this book, just in outline form. And during that time, I met and fell in love with my wife, Emily. And she's been very open about this. Emily has has struggled with depression all of her life. And chatting with her about that, I realized that when she gets represented in a book, it's often a book about depression. And I'm like, but wait, most people I know have some sort of mental health challenge. Like, this is really natural. It's the norm. And yet characters in books don't seem to have any. Why are there not stories? Why are the stories not delving into what it really is to be human, and sometimes how our brain works against us? And I developed the new version of Kaladin based around this idea of, this is a person with depression. That's part of his life. This is not a story about depression. And that, in an odd way, started to become a theme for me. The real lives of the characters, how do you deal with PTSD? How do you deal with various mental health challenges? I have a son who is neuroatypical. And, again, when I saw back in the 90s, there were movies about people who are neurotypical. It's all about that. It's not about a normal life. It's about how big a deal this is. And I'm like, well, can't we approach it from a different direction? Can't we approach it from writing great, epic, heroic stories and epic fantasy stories that happen to contain people who have a wide variety of things that they either struggle with or just different ways of seeing the world? And that became really important to me. I often say that the Stormlight Archive is not about mental health, but the Stormlight Archive is about these people dealing with epic fantasy sort of problems, like the end of the world and things like that. But I'm trying much harder to approach what it is to be human in an authentic way.
That's awesome. So why stay here in Utah? Obviously, you have Dragonsteel here. Mm-hmm. You will have Dragonsteel Plaza eventually. Yes. What is the appeal for you? Why stay here?
Yeah, the appeal of Utah. So people do ask me this because they say, you could live anywhere. And I really could, right? As an author, I could live anywhere. I moved to Utah when I was 18, turning 19, to go to BYU. And I really enjoyed Nebraska, where I grew up, but the weather in Nebraska is awful. I don't know if you've been to the Midwest. People get surprised sometimes. It is really hot and humid in the summers, and really cold and humid and icy, biting snows in the winter. It's where the pioneers had to stop because they're like, no, we cannot go any further. It is too awful. That's next to my house in Nebraska, right? Like that's a 30-minute drive where they're just like, nope. We were able to cross the frozen rivers and all these things, but when we got to Nebraska, we're like, we're just gonna hunker down and wait till this is done. So when I came to Utah, and Utah has, I don't know if people realize this, living here, the summers are more mild. The temperature gets a little higher here and there, but it's so much nicer without the humidity. And then the winters are more mild, and plus you have this gorgeous scenery of all of the mountains, which I absolutely love. And then, my roommate drugged me to the southern Utah vistas, and I fell in love with those. And so there's just really a lot to offer, and I also love that there's a Delta hub here. Nebraska, you always had to kind of fly to another city and then fly to where you're going. From Utah, you can go a lot of places direct, and for someone who has to travel a lot, it's one of the best places to be. Particularly like in the middle of America, you can't really find a better place connection-wise than Utah. It's a hop to Hollywood, which I have to go to these days around once a month. Direct flights to London. Like, this is really a good place to be for that. Plus, I married a Utah girl, and her family's all here. And family being around is just really nice. My children get along really well with their cousins and things like that. So really, where else could we live? I mean, again, I mentioned earlier my wife has depression, so the Pacific Northwest, ride out, right? I don't like it when it gets too hot. So, the South, nope. You got to keep me away from that humidity and things like that. So really, this is one of the best places we could be. We like the people here. We like the vistas here. So yeah, we're never moving. We've invested too much into this.
You mentioned BYU. I wanted to ask you, are you still teaching your fantasy course there? What is that experience like? I've talked to a lot of other fantasy authors who have taken that course and really benefited from it.
So yes, I do still teach my class at BYU. This happened because I was at BYU, and the professor who had been teaching the science fiction fantasy class was retiring. This was Doc Smith. Named after the famous Doc Smith, who was a writer. It wasn't that Doc Smith, but he was great professor, and I was fortunate enough to take a class from him before I graduated. Just a fantastic guy, and he'd always advocated for sci-fi fantasy. And universities don't know what to do with us. I love BYU, don't get me wrong, but universities in general, they just don't know what to do with us because we always end up in the creative writing classes, and all the professors, they have specialized usually in modern and contemporary realistic fiction, right? That's what they've done a lot of their work in. That's what the courses they've taken, and so they're teaching this class, and then there's this sci-fi person that they want to help, but they have no idea what to do with. And so the university, Doc Smith said, you should have a class taught by someone who understands it. And they're like, great, you do that. And so he did for a number of years. And then he was retiring, and they're like, what do we do? And he said, well, you happen to have a guy in the graduate program who has sold a book. Maybe you should have him teach it. And they're like, oh, okay. So they said, do you want to take the sci-fi nerds? And I said, yes. And that was 2003 or 2004 when they did that. They handed it to me and said, good luck. Deal with the sci-fi nerds. We love you for it. And then the class, as my reputation grew, the class became more and more popular. These days we have 300 or 400 people that take it. So we split it from a lecture, and then 15 of them have applied to get into a private, smaller workshop. And I go with those 15 for a separate class after that. So it's technically 2 classes, a lecture and then this thing. And then we sit down and I work with them on their writing and things like you would hope. I can't do that for 300 or 400 people, but I can do it for 15. So 15 people a year we do the workshop with. And it's really fun because people move to Utah to take that class. Every year I have 3 or 4 who have applied and gotten in, and they don't live here, and they just move in for this semester, take my class. It's very odd, I've had 3 CEOs sell their companies and come take my class. Yeah, just that's what they do. They're like, what do I want to do? We don't know. It's purely merit. Like, how good is the writing sample? But during COVID, I had a woman who was in Belgium who was an ER nurse who took my class, signed up for it, and then COVID happened. And it was crazy. But that was done by tele school, whatever you call that, Zoom classes. So she could do that. But she would go deal with ER cases all day of COVID and then come to class. So it's really an interesting course for that reason. But I still intend to keep doing it. I love doing it. Like, I remember as a kid growing up in Nebraska, reading the Dragonlance books by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. And I remember in the back, Tracy Hickman just put in his bio, he said, Tracy loves to play organ at his local Mormon church, right? Just that little line. And as a kid, I was the only LDS kid in my grade, right? There were 4 of us in the whole school of 1,200 kids, right? And so reading that and being like, oh, wait, someone like me does this. Like, a real person does this. That was a moment for me where I'm like, someone like me. And I think that was the first moment where a light went on and said, maybe I could do this. So I thank Tracy for just putting that little line in his bio. And one of the reasons that I keep teaching the course, right, is that, there can be a line in my bio. And if BYU ever says, we don't need this anymore, I'll go to UVU or something, just so there's that line in my bio that the guy living in Utah is writing these fantasy books. Maybe there's some kid out there that reads it and is like, hey, maybe I can do this.
So fantasy, I'm a big fantasy fan, often mirrors our real world, right? Mm-hmm. Like, what real world social or political themes have been most important to you to explore in your novels? I think, you're very adept at character development. The Elantris, I just reread it last week. Like, I loved watching their characters kind of grow over the course of that book. So what is important to you to explore in your fantasy worlds?
This is an excellent question, because people who don't read on fantasy may not understand that fantasy is not about the past. And people who don't read science fiction may not understand science fiction isn't about the future. Science fiction and fantasy and horror, all of the speculative genres, are ways that we explore our now through sometimes exaggerated situations and world building. I always like to say, it gives us an opportunity to do things we couldn't do without bringing in a whole lot of real-world baggage. We can sometimes strip that away, and that's why you can get really interesting stories like Left Hand of Darkness or Handmaid's Tale or things like this that approach ideas from a different direction. Even Lord of the Rings, you look at, the elves and dwarves getting along. Well, that's a fantastical, removed version of how real-world societies build prejudice against each other and how those walls are broken down. You can do this in fantasy in a different way. Plus, you can have dragons, right? That's what I always say. In a lot of ways, for me, one of the reasons I started reading fantasy is because it delved into all these things, but also had a fun adventure story along the way. And things that as a teenager, I would have never picked up a book and read about. For instance, my introduction to fantasy is a book called Dragonsbane, which at its core is about a woman having a midlife crisis, choosing between her career and her family. That's what the story is about. But it's also about the last living dragon slayer having to go slay a dragon when he's middle-aged. And he's not young anymore. He's like, how do I slay a dragon when I'm old? Which I now empathize with so much. These things are things that are interesting to approach, that you can combine with just really fascinating world-building, visuals, exciting, whatnot. For me, where is it? It's different for every book, right? It really is. Themes that keep coming up for me are exploring the different ways that people see the world. I think that books are empathy machines. I think once you read and see through somebody's eyes, it is more difficult to hate that person. And I love that books have done that for me. And that's one of the things that I like to approach. I like to say, what different perspective from myself can I explore in a story in a realistic and hopefully respectful way? That comes up now over and over again. How is it to explore how different people see the world, where dealing with their own individual neuroatypicalness or things like this? And then, of course, I don't like to get too much into politics and whatnot, but whatever is happening on the political scene often ends up in my books. Warbreaker, which is now many years old, came about where America went to war in the early 2000s, and I was thinking about that and how I write a lot of books about how awesome war is, because in books, violence is fun, right? Action scenes are fun. And I thought, well, is this what I really think? Do I think war is awesome? I don't really think war is that awesome. Can I write a book about someone trying to prevent a war, right? And that became the big theme of that book, Warbreaker. It's about Warbreaker, somebody who's trying to stop a war. And this just comes out naturally as I think about myself. Where are my focus? Where are my passions? You'll find it all over the books. But in a lot of ways, as an author, I like to leave that for the reader to interpret. I don't go into my books saying, I'm going to teach you a lesson. I go into my books saying, I want to deal with interesting characters who are struggling with things, and I want to explore the world and my own perspective on it. And I'm trying to tell the best story I can with that. I leave it to the critics, the readers, the audience to decide what any of that means and what the themes actually are. You discover, but know that I'm thinking about a lot of these things as I'm writing.
So hope and perseverance are a huge theme in a lot of your work. Where does that manifest in your writing?
Right.
Yeah.
Hope and perseverance are indeed themes in my book. In fact, my books, I Am Hope is kind of the rallying cry for Mistborn and things like that. Where'd that come from? It is a good question. A lot of times as writers, we write what we want to see that perhaps we're not seeing enough of at the time. One of the things I love about science fiction and fantasy is the most open genre. It's the genre where you can do anything. And anyone gets to be part of sci-fi fantasy. All they have to do is make something up that can't exist. Shakespeare, you put a ghost in, great. You're now sci-fi fantasy. Welcome to the club, right? Whatever you do, as soon as you take that step into the implausible or impossible, you join with us. And I love that. It's a very big genre. But when I was breaking in, the subgenre of sci-fi fantasy that was really popular is called grimdark. Grimdark is pioneered by George R. Martin, the fantastic writer and kind of the grand patriarch of the fantasy genre right now. And Joe Abercrombie, my friend Joe, he was breaking in and doing really great things with grimdark. And grimdark is a great genre. If you don't understand grimdark, it's you can, by showing how dark things can get, you can add really interesting contrast, and you can highlight problems. You can write things in an interesting way. Some of my favorite short stories are really dark, but as a writer, I find that I naturally gravitate toward points of light, toward a difficult world that has points of light. That is my philosophy on life. I believe there is light and hope in life. And I understand it gets dark sometimes. Like, part of the reason that we write books is so that you can, in proxy, experience dark times and maybe see how people struggle through it and hopefully gain some better awareness of your own struggles and maybe even some tools to approach it. My old professor, Dave, who taught the class I teach at BYU for a few years before I taught it, he always said books are like a balloon for your emotions, that when you feel these powerful emotions, it's like you stretch yourself so that later on, hopefully, if you feel them in your life, your capacity has been stretched so that you can better deal with all of those emotions. And I love writing stories about hope. Because I think we all need a little bit more in our lives. At some point, if you don't need it now, you're going to need it. And that's my passion. That's what I believe. And I hope that books can make the world a better place, and I hope I can make them a better place with this. That's not to downplay the value of a good dystopian dark story, which, like I said, I don't think we're in conflict with one another. I do think we're in dialogue with one another, the different subgenres. But I write what is classically called epic fantasy, and this was the genre founded by Tolkien. And Tolkien was all about, look, as bad as the world is right now, there is hope. There's Gandalf talking about the optimism, even in the face of a siege that looks like it's going to kill them all. That is one of the core themes of Tolkien.
Yeah. What other themes are your passions? What else do you like to explore?
What other themes are my passions? We've talked about a lot of them. Real people and how they might experience incredible events and how they might deal with them is one of the themes that I like to get at. But every book, there's a different thing that we're looking at. Like Fires of December, the book that's coming out in December again, it's all about how do we interface with the different expectations people have for us based on how they view us, right? And what do we do with those boxes society puts us in? How many boxes, how many hats do we wear, and how do we interface with all those different expectations? That's the theme of that book. I can't talk about the ones, that there are books that I've worked on off and on and whatnot. But if we look at Mistborn, Mistborn's theme was, what is the price of trust? What is the cost of trust? And is it worth paying that cost, even if, loving someone might cause you pain? Is it worth trusting again? That's the core central theme, and it gets back to that idea of hope, that we hope, even if things have gone poorly, that they will go well next time. Sayzed says, that's the nature of hope. The nature of hope is this idea that we sometimes believe it's strongest when times are darkest, when we need to believe as human beings. And so that's a different theme. And when you sit down to write a book, oftentimes, at least when I do it, I'm not thinking about that theme primarily. I'm thinking about who the characters are. And then what I tend to do is I tend to outline a book plot-wise pretty extensively and world-building very extensively. And then I tend to write my way into characters, do a few sample chapters with them, see how they might react to this world and to the problem I've dropped them into. Because I really like to approach it that way, right? Like when we end up in our lives, we're not expecting. I wasn't expecting the Wheel of Time to get dropped in my lap, right? There are a lot of things that happen to us that we don't expect. You get dropped into this, and then you deal with it. I drop my characters into this, say, this is what's happening. This is what you're expected to do. And then I write a little ways and see how they interface with it. They have veto power over the plot, right? Like if the character who they're becoming wouldn't do something, I got to go back to outline and rebuild this outline and whatnot. And that's where theme comes in. How the character interfaces with this story that I've devised and the choices they make grows that theme. I don't generally sit down and think of it ahead of time. I let it come naturally.
Cool. Strong female characters. Serene,
yeah.
Vin, Shallan, many, many others. How do you approach writing strong, powerful women that are dealing with trauma?
Right.
Yeah.
So how do you approach this? This is the big question. How do I approach writing strong female characters? It's become a trope, strong female characters.
I know.
Right. Yeah. But still, it's a good question. People ask it. How do you go about writing people who are different from yourself? And how do you go about writing strong characters in general? My background in sci-fi fantasy is I was brought into this by Barbara Hamley, Melanie Ron, and Anne McCaffrey. These were the first authors that I read, just by coincidence. And so my introduction to fantasy was from a female viewpoint. The first books. Before I had read basically anything, those are the books that I had read. And I read that before I read Robert Jordan. wasn't publishing fantasy or epic fantasy at the time. Wheel of Time hadn't started. I read that before I read Tad Williams, who became one of my favorites. Anne McCaffrey remained like my favorite author for many, many years. Still criminally underread. Everybody should read Anne McCaffrey. She's amazing. But regardless, that perspective mixed with the fact that my mother, she graduated in accounting at BYU in a year where she was the only woman in most of her classes. She's had a very big influence on my life. I didn't now necessarily set out to make this a theme, but the first book that I wrote that didn't get published, fortunately, the female character was terrible. Was weak love interesty, right? And I was like, this won't fly. This isn't how books are supposed to be. I can't give this to my sister to read. And I really had to work on it. And it came down to not writing characters to archetype, not writing them to role, writing them to like, who are they? What are their passions? Every character views themselves as the protagonist of their story. Not everyone sees themselves as a hero, but they are innately the protagonist. And even like if you sit down and say, this is the love interest, you're usually going to get a weaker character. If you get down and say, this is this person's perspective on life, this is how they fit what people expect them to be, and this is how they do not fit. And all of us have things that people expect and things that don't expect from the roles that they would put upon them. And when I started writing people to people, and when I started looking at the philosophy of how do our flaws make us stronger? How do our flaws make us people? You're nodding at that one because how do our flaws turn us into the people we are? How does resisting our flaws? That's when characters really started to click for me. And obviously, being a woman, being a man, being gender fluid, these are all going to be things that influence how we interact, how we're socialized and whatnot. So it's really important. It's very important. Biology and conditioning are both really, really important. And I look at those things, but those things are flavors to, I think, our passions and our flaws, rather than, for most people, the deciding factor. And I put this all in the alchemy, then I show it to people. And I say, does this work? Does this feel like your lived experience? Does this feel like the lived experience of people you've known? And when I get it wrong, I do it over. That's the idea. Sometimes it's easier than others.
Yeah, and that segues perfectly to the next question. We covered this a minute ago, but a lot of your characters, almost all your main characters, are rooted in trauma. And I'm really curious, why is that such an effective vehicle for making characters relatable to the reader? Yeah, why that decision?
So why are so many of my characters' experiences rooted in trauma? This comes down to a couple of things. The first thing is, what makes a story, as I told you, is conflict. Conflict makes a story. And the queen died, not a story. The queen died and the king died of grief is a story, like that classic adage. Of course, the queen died can be a story, but this is trying to teach a lesson that it's the grief that makes a story. It's the struggle that makes a story. It is not the event that makes the story. And because of this, a lot of characters, the way that we approach them is we approach them and say, all right, big events have happened. If a person's going to deal with this realistically, what's it going to do to them? It's this idea of trying to approach them not from this sort of mythological perspective, from a contemporary, like, what is it like to be a human being in these situations perspective. For a lot of time through history, we did approach things from the mythological perspective. And you can see in Tolkien the contrast between them. Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas are approached from a mythological perspective. These are heroes like Beowulf. These are heroes that their trauma doesn't inform who they are. The legends really create them. But then he put real people into it. Tolkien was a Beowulf scholar, and I always think that he wrote Hobbit in part because he's like, well, what if it weren't Beowulf who had to do these things? What if it were a little hobbit? If you're not familiar with Beowulf, there is a scene where a person steals a cup from a dragon's hoard and sneaks out with it, right? Like there's echoes. And then you come to Lord of the Rings, and it's like the central figures are people from our world who their trauma defines them. Gollum, Sam, Frodo, and even Merry and Pippin to a lesser extent. They're in this world of mythological heroes who are hundreds of years old and don't have to deal with trauma, but they're real people, and they do. And that, I think, is part of the reason we connect with Tolkien on a different level from perhaps some of the old epics, which I love, but there's something more personal about Tolkien when we can watch how, Gollum was changed by this trauma and how Frodo is now dealing with the same thing. And that's fascinating to me. That's interesting. One of the things that I think connects us all is trauma. Life is trauma. Like, life is pain, princess. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. We'll all go through it. And that's, I think, part of the purpose of life. And so learning to deal with it must also be part of the purpose of life. And so if we don't deal with it in our books, then, it's fine, right? There are lots of what we call iconic characters in books that don't, they're not informed by their trauma, but it's not what I like to write. So, again, I'm glad that there's lots of different types of stories out there.
Yeah. Flipping the script, where are we at with all the Apple TV stuff?
Apple TV stuff. Where are we with the Apple TV and Apple Film and all of this? So, for those who don't know, I signed a big deal with Apple back in late last year to bring the Cosmere to life, specifically Stormlight and Mistborn. Stormlight for premium cable, Mistborn for wide release theatrical. And so my job has been to write the screenplays and convince them that these books can work in screen form. They still believe, they do believe. They wouldn't have bought the rights and things if they didn't. But the whole thrust of this deal was, all right, we're going to put Brandon kind of in the James Gunn slot, right? Where it's like, Brandon's going to architect all of this. Not fully. I haven't made films before. Don't get me wrong, and don't let me overemphasize. I can't be Kevin Feige or James Gunn yet. But what I can do is I can write really killer screenplays, teleplay for Stormlight, screenplay for Mistborn, to prove that this can all work, and then kind of be the guiding force that adds continuity to all of this. I will need actual filmmakers and actual producers to do their parts as well. But where are we? I'm almost done with the Mistborn screenplay. It's looking real good. They've seen early looks at pieces of it. I'm gathering the feedback, and it's all looking great. We have our producer. I don't know if they've signed the deal yet, so I can't announce it, but you should expect to find out who the producer is. Most people won't know the names of most producers in Hollywood. This is, the behind-the-scenes people that make things happen. But picked a really great producer. Had a lot of meetings on that. And once I have the screenplay done and revisions done to it, then starts the director hunt. And that'll be the big one, right? So where are we? We're there. I haven't started on Stormlight yet. I'm still working to find a showrunner to be a partner in making that. And so I will co-show run it, but I need somebody, again, I can do narrative, I can do structure, I can do screenplays. I know how to connect all of this. But I've only been a producer on one series so far that's gotten made, and that was Wheel of Time. So I have very fledgling experience in Hollywood for things actually getting made. So I definitely want to find a really good partner to help show run that, and that's where we are right now. Just kind of taking it step by step. And listening to Apple's guidance. They've been wonderful. This has been the best experience I've had in Hollywood so far. So really happy, really excited. Screenplay's looking great. I think I proved to them that Mistborn can work in a screenplay format. Again, I think they believed, but the proof is in the actual writing.
Sure. You mentioned epic fantasy. Mm-hmm. How do you think about pacing? And I know it's going to vary project to project.
Yeah.
But yeah, talk to us about pacing a little bit.
So let's talk pacing. Pacing is very different based on your book. And the thing that influences pacing most for me is twofold. There's two things. One is subgenre, and the other is number of viewpoints. So subgenre gets into what the reader's expectations are. If you're reading an epic fantasy, you expect a different kind of pacing than if you're reading a 100,000-word murder mystery. Sure. And both can be fantasy books, but in the epic fantasy, what we're generally looking to do is give you a big chunk to read and then put the book down and digest. Right? We know you won't be able to read a 400,000 word book, which is like, 1,000 pages, 1,200 pages in one sitting. You're just not going to. And so instead, we want to have sections that are big, sweeping, epic sections that come to conclusions that you're like, all right, I can put the book down and digest now. A shorter book often will be read in 1 to 2 sittings, maybe 3. But a lot of times people are reading in one sitting. Because of that, you instead spend a lot more time leading each chapter into the next one to give them that kind of momentum, to push them into the next chapter so that they can experience it kind of as one whole thing, almost like sitting down, watching a movie, and then having it to digest. And you approach the pacing for those two different things in different ways. I would say one of the biggest changes in writing comparing the 90s to now, 90s when I grew up reading, and now is you want your pacing to be faster in general, even in the epic fantasy. You want your pacing to just move better. I think we're just a little bit better at that than we used to be. We stand on the shoulders of giants, but we definitely can move things faster and know how to weave the threads together and whatnot. I've been reading Dungeon Crawler Carl, like half of the world. Yeah, and that's his expertise, pacing. He paces those books brilliantly.
I've heard rumblings about Dragonsteel Plaza. Can you
Yes.
give us some type of...
So what is Dragonsteel Plaza? We bought some land a few years ago because I want to build a bookstore. I've always wanted to have a bookstore. And things go epic when we're involved. And so we're like, bookstores are great, but what would be nice is like a nice sort of just like a nice plaza that had some like cafes and some shops and then a big cool bookstore. That's what it turned into. So we bought enough land that we can put in some nifty little retail shops and a nice plaza and a cool bookstore. Will we ever get it built? I don't know. It's a big project. So we haven't even broken ground yet. We have like all the architectural stuff, and then we threw all that away and did a new architectural thing. So who knows?
Elantris Part 2.
Elantris Part 2. Someday I will write Elantris Part 2, but I can't promise when.
Okay, fair enough. Where's Dragonsteel? Where's the show going when the palace closes?
Oh, yeah. So for those who don't know, I run a convention called Dragonsteel Nexus. It's really cool. It's a lot of fun. It sells out every year. But the Salt Palace is going under construction starting like next year. We thought it was going to be in 2 years. Nope, it's next year. Then that's where we hold it. And there isn't a place big enough in Utah to have it. So we're going to Denver. For the next 4 or 5 years, we'll be in Denver.
Cool. Okay. Great. Have to go check it out. Just taking a swing here. Are you on some level Hoid Wit? Or if not, who is that? Or can you speak to Hoid Wit as a character?
People often ask, am I Wit or Hoid? He's the character who moves through almost all of my books, who does cameos in them. He's often a storyteller. I obviously do empathize with him, but I don't think of myself as him. So he's meaner than I am.
He is pretty mean.
He's crasser than I am. Yeah. And he's more clever than I am. As an author, you can write characters more clever than you because a lot of cleverness comes down to how fast they're able to come up with jokes, puns, responses, and whatnot, and you can take forever to get that. So he's all of those things that I am not. He is mostly based on, if I'm going to point at a place, it's the Shakespearean Fool. Read a lot of Shakespeare when I was a kid, you have to. And then in college took some Shakespeare courses, and I'm like, oh, there's something to the Twelfth Night / the Fool from King Lear / Falstaff / some of these characters that Shakespeare was doing that's just really fun. Somebody who has a perspective on the story that the other characters don't. And Hoid doesn't break the fourth wall. He's not outside, but he often is outside the world. He's come from another planet, and he understands that the Cosmere is bigger than just one story, and that gives him a specific perspective that is really interesting.